Hi, so we'll talk about the economic history of India and China, specifically about why India is lagging behind China in the economic sphere. So we have covered a lot of things in the previous video. It was a very long video and we have decided to put that in different parts and multiple videos. We would likely do that with this video also because this is likely to be a bit longer. We also want to share the PPT to students who are our paid subscribers so they can take value out of this. So we'll talk about economic history specifically of India. We'll look at India first, we'll look at China after that, and we'll compare and contrast how these two different economies grew up. So why the difference in growth? In 1950, China's GDP was close to 30.55, India's GDP was 30.6. So the point here is the GDP of both the countries are very similar. They were right out of independence. They were trying to become new independent strong countries. So the GDP was very similar in 1950. In 2020, there is a very huge difference. China's GDP is close to 15.4 trillion US dollars and India's GDP is close to 2.6 trillion dollars. We have goals of becoming a $5 trillion economy only by 2023 or 2022. Yeah, so China's GDP has grown close to 500% and 500 times, and India's GDP has grown only by 85 times. So that is about the difference. So we want to understand why this is the case. We need some sort of a historical background about where India and China have really come from. They both got their independence around 1950, at the turn of the 1950s. So for China, it was a very strong and large country. It was a communist country, so very strong and large. It had all the resources, it had a vast population. It was a communist leadership, so you know about, in the previous part we covered about the civil war of China. So the nationalists and the communists were fighting. China was also actively engaged in World War II, and they were considered to be one of the victors of World War II, and they were even granted high positions in UNSC. So China fought with Japan. It fought off Japan after the World War II. It was under the communist leadership. So the communist leadership obviously has heavy influence of Russia because Russia was having a socialist leadership at that point of time. And there was some amount of dictatorial tendency latent in the Chinese leadership. So that was about China. About India, our leaders had committed to becoming a democratic republic, and we were also struggling with partition. So India and Pakistan had forcibly partitioned, and the partition line was very artificial. It was done by the British people. And we also had to deal with a large number of princely states. Within the Indian boundary, you had a large number of princely states, something close to 500. So they had to be integrated. It was a duty of the government to integrate all that. So that took a lot of political work, and it was draining the economy to some extent. India was looked down upon its European powers because of its extreme poverty. India was very poor. So it was looked down upon. It was not granted high position in UNSC like China was. China was considered to be very large and independent, but India was considered to be a colonial state even after its independence. So there was this slight influence of Russia on India because Jawaharlal Nehru actively admired the socialist regime of Russia. But we were committed to being non-aligned. In spite of Jawaharlal Nehru liking Russia a bit, we were not leaning either towards Russia or towards the USA in the Cold War era. We were struggling with a lot of poor policies from the British era, especially regarding land. So land was one of the first policies which independent India had to contend with. So this was the historical background of these two countries immediately after independence. Land reforms in India. So in this slide, the major point is there is a drastic difference in how two different political systems handle one single issue. So land reform, how is it handled by a democratic system? How is it handled by a communist system? So naturally, you would understand the democratic system will, induce people. They would try to convince people and all that. But in the communist system, violence was not uncommon. So democratic system, initially, we had the right to property in our constitution. So it was given to every single person, but that came in the way of developmental policies of the government. It was eventually abolished. We tried to abolish intermediaries in the landlord system by law. So we tried to do that. And there was a ceiling on land holdings. So a private person cannot really hold more than a specific allotment of land. So this land holding, the ceiling of land holding, it varied from state to state because land is basically a state subject. So different states had different rules. There were three major land reform movements which are to be noted. One is in West Bengal because West Bengal was massively screwed up by the British people. right after independence. It had been under the British rule for a very long time. So the landlord system flourished there, and there were millions of farmers who did not have land, but thousands of zamindars or landlords who held all the land. So a lot of violence happened in West Bengal, and farmers tried to forcibly take away their land. In Kerala, the Communist Party rose. It was one of the first instances in the entire world where a Communist Party ruled a state government in a democratic country. So the Communist Party actively worked towards equality and equity. So it wanted to redistribute the land resources of Kerala government. So that was very successful. To this day, the Communist Party has a lot of loyal supporters in Kerala. So the Bhudan movement was one movement which was based on the Gandhian principles. So it was started by a person called Vinoba Bhave, where in the southern parts of India, in peninsular India, he wanted to induce rich people who had a lot of land to donate that land for the sake of public welfare. So that was how India approached the entire thing. For China, Mao Zedong promised the communist ideals to exist, and he did not shy away from killing a lot of landlords. So the Communist Party induced the poor peasants of China to actively take up revolution, to actively take up arms to get what they wanted. So under the communist principle, mass killing of landlord to get land was not really frowned upon. So that was fine. So the approach of China was one of very a very violent and sudden revolution. So before the revolution in early 1949 and 1950, the percentage of land held by poor farmers was close to 14%. But after the revolution, it became close to 47%. Some estimates take it to as high as 55%. So by 1958, private ownership was entirely abolished in China. So there was no such thing called as a private property. Everything is supposed to go to the community, and the households all over China were organized into state operated communes. So that was about land reforms. Yeah, so in this slide we'll talk about China's economic policy disaster in the initial phase. So in the last slide we talked about how India and China had different approaches because of the different political systems. Chinese economic policy was very closely related to the political philosophy. The political philosophy had a very strong hold over how China's economy functioned. So, like I mentioned in the last slide, by 1958, just about every single piece of land in the country was removed from the private hands. So that was a grip of China, but still it did not have a smooth run. It made a lot of mistakes. So the first major mistake was the aggressive pursuit of a communist society under the vision of Mao Zedong. He wanted to bring a communist society as quickly as possible, but the people of China were not really tuned to that. So this was all about a vision of a single leader. He wanted industrial expansion to happen rapidly. He was trying to compete with Russia in some level. He wanted to be like Russia. Agricultural productivity, he wanted to expand that, and self-sufficiency was stressed. In India also self-sufficiency was stressed, but here it was extremely aggressive. So there was this widespread misinformation and exaggeration of numbers, because in the centralized setup, the Communist Party will give national goals for each and every province. So the province has to abide by those goals. And in many instances, it was quite unrealistic. So the local officials resorted to exaggeration of numbers, and a lot of misinformation and propaganda was spread. So because of all this, there is two great concepts between 1958 and 1961 in China. One is the Great Leap Forward, and the other is the Great Chinese Famine. This happened first, and this happened after that. So under the Great Leap Forward, China initially had fire plans, but the fire plan did not really work out for China. It was based on the Russian model. The leaders decided it did not really work out. So what they wanted to do was they wanted to mobilize people in a political revolution sort of thing, and they wanted the people to work really hard. So they found out people who had extra time. They found out people who were not doing enough work, who were not productive enough, and they were forcibly taken to industries. They were forcibly taken to irrigation projects, and a lot of violence was involved during this period in the initial stage. So people were organized into different communes. So farming communes existed, industrial communes existed, and under the communes were given some sort of a target, and they were supposed to cover that. Industries in rural areas, that was emphasized. Backyard furnaces also existed. So what is a backyard furnace? The commune is supposed to have some sort of a furnace, a small furnace, and that furnace has to process iron ore and produce iron and steel. But the backyard furnace did not really work out because you can't simply have a small plant and then expect every single place in the country to produce iron and steel. So the basic point about the Great Leap Forward was the mobilization of people was very immense. A lot of people were mobilized, but the quality of work was not really good. Especially with irrigation projects, the quality was very bad. There were no engineers or scientists to supervise the construction. All the people who did not have work, all the people who were not productive enough, they were forcibly taken away and made to construct dams all across China. So that was one thing. And a direct consequence of the poor irrigation project was the Great Chinese Famine. So under the Great Chinese Famine, there were 2 or 3 years which were not really good for China from the climate perspective. So a cyclone happened, and then a lot of dams were damaged in one go. 62 dams in one go were damaged, and then food was lost. So before the Great Chinese Famine, China was very aggressive. Its productivity was increasing, and then it was exporting food to the rest of the world. But after the complete devastation, China had no food, and a lot of people died. It is estimated to be the largest famine in human history. So approximately 30 million people died, but we don't know the records. So that was about China's economic policy disaster. We'll go into the next slide now, in which we'll talk about India's economic history. We'll take different aspects. We'll also try to compare it with China. We won't cover every single point. We'll only talk about the point till liberalization happened. Yeah, so we'll talk about the economic history of India. We'll only talk about the major events because we are trying to compare both the economic history of India with that of China. So we'll cover the major themes. This particular slide is talking about the theme of India having some sort of a socialist leaning in which the government tries to control the majority of economic activity. So basically, so this entire thing is about India being kind of a socialist economy. So it was very poor initially. So we have talked about that multiple number of times. It was very poor. Agriculture contributed significantly to the GDP. So we had the socialist leaning because the leaders were admiring Russia and they imported a lot of ideas from Russia, especially the idea of 5-year plans. So 5-year plans was something implemented by Soviet Russia. So we tried to implement that. We have had totally 12 5-year plans. So the last 5-year plan was between 2012 and 2017 when in 2014, Niti Aayog was actually brought up. So license Raj was a major feature of India. It is a significance of it signifies the red tape culture in our country simply because there are so many licenses which need to be given out for a business to start. It is said that more than 80 licenses were required in some cases to start a business. Everything will be controlled by the government, regulated by the government, especially about what you produce, who you sell it to and all that. In 1950s, the focus was on irrigation. The focus was on improving the productivity of agriculture. So India constructed a lot of dams at that point of time. The population was rising and mortality was reducing because healthcare services got better and irrigation projects were implemented. A lot of dams were created. And we also started many technical institutes, especially for engineering. So that was that period. In the late 1950s, the focus was on public industries. So this part is about the second 5-year plan. So in the second 5-year plan, we focused heavily on heavy industries. That was coal, iron and steel, fertilizers and all. So especially steel and coal was the heavy focus. So we sought the help of Germany and Russia. So they came to India and constructed plants. And we also focused on importing capital goods. So that was something that we did. You have two different types of goods. Capital goods, which is technology intensive. It can be used to produce economic activity in the country. And you have consumer goods like foodstuff, for example. So India was importing foodstuff quite a lot, but the second 5-year plan wanted to import capital goods more. So we have always targeted self-sufficiency in food. So that was a major theme of Third World War. But we were cut short in between because of the war with China. We also had war with Pakistan during that time in 1965. We had war with China in 1962. So defense expenditure had to be ramped up. We focused on road building and education initially. So education was initially centralized. So we started giving guidelines to the state governments to start the education. We also started focusing on national highways. So that was one thing. We attempted to bring in local democracy. So that was a major political development, not directly related to economics, but in some ways it is one of the most important points in the history of India. So we also talked about, we also have this devaluing of Indian rupee to avoid balance of payment crisis. So BOP means balance of payment. So balance of payment arises, balance of payment crisis happens when the country imports more than it exports. So you have a a shortage of currency. So Indian rupee was not really convertible. So there is this concept of convertibility of currency, which means you can take the Indian rupee and exchange it with something else. But that was not really applicable because the rupee was completely under the control of the government. It was not functioning based on market rules. So Indian rupee was devalued multiple number of times in successive stages by the government, so that balance of payment crisis could be averted. Also, 14 banks were nationalized under Indira Gandhi. This was another move aimed at increasing socialism. So the central government tried to control every aspect of the financial existence of our country. So these banks were nationalized. The banks were given very clear guidelines about who to give out loans to and what sectors to give loans to and all that. So this was about the socialist era of our country. We'll move to the next slide. So yeah, so this slide basically talks about the various reforms that needed to be done, because with the socialist regime, it was very clear that the system was not growing, the economy was not growing at expected rates, and there was a lot of crisis. So we had to improve the overall productivity of the country. We had to bring in reforms in financial sector, in agriculture, in industry, in just about everything. So we started with Green Revolution. It was started in late 1960s in the Indira Gandhi period. So Green Revolution aimed at bringing high variety seeds. It aimed at bringing in fertilizers, irrigation and all. So the productivity, rapidly increased, especially in Punjab and Haryana. We also have White Revolution. So with Green Revolution, we associate M.S. Swaminathan. With White Revolution, we associate with Verghese Kurian. So White Revolution was basically brought about by the cooperative movement. You would remember the story of Amul from Gujarat, which is a cooperative movement. So under the cooperative movement, different people were brought up together and they had common goals. So it was similar. It was something similar to what was actually happening in China. So the cooperative movement was extremely successful, and after about 20 years of ushering in the White Revolution, India became self-sufficient in milk, which it was not before that. So we also campaigned very heavily to remove poverty from the country. Poverty was a very big focus. It was a populist program brought about by the Indira Gandhi government in the 1970s. So this was to some extent successful. Many schemes were brought in at that point of time to generate employment, to give money, to reduce inequality and give money to the poor people. So after the Garibi Hatao campaign by the government, we had this dark period in Indian history called as the emergency. It was under the Indira Gandhi government. It was unconstitutional in many ways, and it was authoritarian to some extent. So Indira Gandhi was removed and the Janata Party came into power. The Janata Party clearly had the agenda that it wanted to remove all sorts of corruption that had crept in the Indian economy. So they conducted demonetization one. So a lot of Indian currency notes were devalued, where they were not really legal tender after some time. So that had a major effect. This is one major point here. FERA is the expansion of FERA is the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act. So it basically talked about the FDI limits of a particular foreign company in an Indian company. So the FDI restriction was close to 49%. So no foreign company could hold more than 49% stake in a joint venture with the Indian company. So that was a major problem. So this is basically because India had an apprehension towards foreign companies. We had a very bad experience. So we did not want foreign companies to have free hand. We wanted to be independent. We wanted to be self-sufficient. So that was one major thing. And because of this draconian act, many foreign companies actually left India. One of the prominent foreign companies was Coca-Cola. So we attempted to liberalize after some time. We tried to remove price controls, initiate fiscal reforms, revamp the public sector. We tried to reduce import duties, and we also tried to de-license the domestic industry. All this was carried out because the government recognized that having very strict curbs was not really helping the economy. So around the same time, China was opening up to the world, and a lot of foreign investment it was attracting. So its growth rate was rapidly increasing. So at this point of time, India realized that having all these archaic laws did not really help the economy. So they wanted to do something better. So removal of price control was one major thing. All the prices of commodities were regulated by the government. So that had to be given to the free market. Fiscal reforms were done because India was frequently overspending. It did not get enough revenue to account for the spending that it was doing. So they wanted to reduce their spending. They also wanted to revamp the public sector because India was having a lot of public sector companies which were not doing well, which were not profitable. So they wanted to either reinvest in something else or remove the importance of public sector. They also tried to reduce import duties because to improve as a manufacturing entity, it needed capital goods from other country. It needed raw materials and spare parts from other countries. But India had very high import duty because it was one of the sources of revenue for the government. So they tried to remove that. We also have delicensing of the domestic industry, which is clearly straightforward. So there is one major reform relating to population, which was conducted in early 1980s. So at this point, people recognize that population of India needs to be curbed. It can't keep growing on because the resources were scarce. So this particular family planning was a major initiative of Indira Gandhi's son. So he was very active into that. By this time, after a lot of reforms, after the steady growth of India over the last 30 years, there was a small section of middle class, especially concentrated in cities. The rural areas did not really benefit, did not really have a prominent middle class. So the middle class was capable of buying cars. For example, cars were manufactured for the first time in our country, especially the Maruti car. So the Maruti car was initially the initiative of the government. Eventually, it was not very efficient. They realized it and they teamed up with Suzuki of Japan to create the Maruti Suzuki brand. So people had large homes, so there was some sort of affluence in the society, and entertainment industry also flourished. So Bollywood had caught up with the people with the increase in television, with the increase in technology. People were having increasing access to entertainment industry, so that was growing. So the Bhopal gas tragedy of 1984, that was a major turning point because we realized that the labor laws of our country were very lax. The people of our country were not really protected. So that was one major turning point. So after this, India wanted to have some sort of protection for the labor force. Stress on productivity and employment was under the Rajiv Gandhi government after Indira Gandhi was assassinated. So productivity and employment was of heavy focus. So a lot of schemes in employment were from this era. Employment benefits were also from this era. So IT and telecom sector growth. So at this point of time in the world, IT sector was, it was growing. It was only during the 1970s and 1980s that IT was growing even in USA. So in mid 1980s, India, especially under the leadership of Rajiv Gandhi, it took up the IT sector and the telecom sector very happily, and it grew very quickly. So one important point here is that there were a lot of attempts to improve the economy, a lot of attempts to reform the economy based on experience. India was still focused on being self-reliant. It did not want the foreign hand to come into the picture. And it wanted everything to be done under the supervision of the government. So that was one major thing. There is this last point of BSE Sensex in 1986. So the sensitive index of Bombay Stock Exchange was introduced in 1986, and we shifted to online trading by 1995. So earlier in stock exchanges, trading used to happen manually with a lot of people involved, but online trading was quickly adopted by India in 1995. It took only 50 days to transition between the previous method and online trading. So the point here is India was very quick to adopt certain technologies, especially the technologies in services. We were very good with services, but somewhere in between we had lost out on industry. So in 1990s, this entire LPG reforms happened. So LPG stands for liberalization, privatization, and globalization. So we had this major crisis of balance of payment. Especially, this was a major feature of Indian economy. That is, India was always spending more and importing more than exporting. So to tide over the balance of payment crisis, India was forced to pledge gold to banks of other nations so that it could get loans. So India pledged gold to the banks of Switzerland, Japan, and UK. So shiploads of gold were actually sent to these countries, and then a loan was acquired. So under the conditions, the gold was for collateral. We bought it back eventually, but under the conditions of the loan, India had to liberalize. So that was one major point. So under the liberalization period, license Raj was eventually ended. The government very firmly realized that having too many licenses was stopping the private sector from actually growing. So that was one major thing. And the government also focused on downsizing, because you would remember the prestige of a government job at that point of time. So the government wanted to diversify. It wanted the people to take up more private jobs. So downsizing of the government was one important thing. We also wanted to increase FDI and foreign investments. So increasing FDI would be done based on increasing the limit to which foreign companies could have a stake in Indian companies. So that was one thing. To attract investments, we had the concept of special economic zones. Special economic zones were started in China about 1 decade earlier. So we started after the 1990s. We also had this concept of disinvestment in PSUs because the government recognized that there are so many public sector units which are not really efficient and which are not profitable. So it wanted to give some stake of the public sector unit to private entities. So that was about disinvestment. Disinvestment, by the way, is happening even now. The government has a lot of stake even now in so many public sector units, and they want to actively get out of that. So banking reforms also happened. It did not end with the initial reforms of 1991 to 1993. Banking reforms happened. So here, the major focus was on reduction in CRR and SLR rates. CRR stands for cash reserve ratio, and SLR stands for statutory liquidity ratio. So they basically signify that the proportion of funds that the banks usually allocate for emergency purpose, that has to be reduced. So basically, the reform was to encourage banks to lend more. So that was one thing. We also loosened regulations for private banks. Earlier, private banks were dictated in every single way of their operation. So they were dictated about who their loans were supposed to go, about how much they could give loan. Every single aspect of banking governance had some limit from RBI. So that was regulated to some extent because that is the way in which a free market will progress. Liberalizing interest rates is also one thing which is heavily related to that. So this is about the LPG reforms of 1990s and also the banking reforms. We'll see what was the effect of that. So in 1991-92, US dollar 132 million was the amount of foreign investment in the country. But immediately after the reforms, just after 4 years, it rose to 5.3 billion. So initially 132 million, and then later in just 4 years, 5,300 million. So the amount of money that the foreign companies and countries were putting into our country was immense. It was a massive growth. But the GDP did not grow as such. GDP was growing very slowly. The only major increase was in foreign investment. But that was very important. So this is one common point which is true in general. If you have a particular state where there is a pro-employer labor law, then the employer will be very happy. If you have a state which is pro-worker, then the industry expansion in that state is going to be very slow. So that is one common point just about everywhere. There is also this NDA rule. Congress government had ruled the country for a very long time. The NDA rule was between 1998 and 2004 under the Vajpayee government. So the Vajpayee government, the NDA alliance was in general economically liberal. So they were very much in favor of liberal policies. So they liked the LPG reforms. They continued it across. They accelerated the growth up until 2004. MGNREG under the UPA government. So we are talking about other aspects now. Till then, the acceleration of the LPG reforms happened. From here, we are talking about other major events in Indian economic history. So MGNREG was one thing which it was created by the UPA government under the Manmohan Singh government to stimulate the rural economy. Basically, it's a job guarantee kind of a scheme. So every single person in the rural economy will have 100 days of guaranteed employment. So that was one thing. We abolished the planning commission because we realized that India is no longer going to be a socialist economic model. We wanted to move towards a capitalist model. So planning commission will only work when you have a single type of economy having uniform characteristics. But we realized that the Indian economy was very diverse. It was very dynamic. So there entered the institution of Niti Aayog. So Niti Aayog was created in 2014. It's a very dynamic organization. It advises various levels of the government. It advises various ministries of the government on how to go about. We also have the insolvency code, which is one major reform targeted at reducing the non-performing assets of banks. So different companies do not really perform well, in which case the banks have the right to initiate insolvency proceedings and then recover as many resources as possible. So we also wanted to crack down on economic offenders. The most important example you would remember is Vijay Mallya. So Vijay Mallya was one person who duped Indian citizens and then he went off to a different country and he's staying there even now. So there are so many people like that who get as much value out of India as possible and then they go away. So we wanted to crack down on economic offenders and the laws were tightened. Major reforms under the NDA government after 2014 was demonetization 2 and GST reform. These are supposed to be very big reforms. Demonetization 2 was basically aimed at reducing the black money of the country, but it was very sudden for the economy and it had economic effects. India did not grow well after that. but it also accelerated. The cash economy was not really focused, not really in the focus after that. The digital economy grew very rapidly after this. GST reforms, it is said to be one of the largest reforms of the kind in the entire world. So GST reforms basically relates to indirect taxes. Earlier, different states had different indirect tax rules. They had multiple rules and regulations, but we wanted to streamline all that as a one nation, one market sort of thing. We have always focused on self-sufficiency right after independence. We are focusing on that even now, basically because our industry did not develop. Up until 1990s, we had problems with food, we had problems with agriculture. We brought in green revolution, we became self-sufficient to some extent with food. And in the late 1980s, the telecom sector came up, the IT sector came up, and Indians were very quick to grab that. So one major problem is that we did not grow in industry. So now we are trying to grow in industry with Make in India program, Atmanirbhar Bharat and all that. So there is also this idea of diversifying Indian industry, because Indian corporates are very good in some sectors like coal, iron and steel, fertilizers, for example. Not fertilizers, coal, iron and steel and IT. But in some other sectors, we are not really good. So we want to diversify and improve upon our techniques. So this is about the short economic history of India. We'll move on quickly to the short economic history of China. Thanks for watching this video. We'll continue this topic in the next video.